Yes, this is a nocturne, and perhaps that's the reason that one Chopin lover hears as he listens twilight, the stillness of the night, and the thoughts that such an in-between time calls forth. Or another listener insists this nocturne is best heard on a gray day of the soul, when the times are out of joint. Its silken tones will bring a triste or melancholy feeling as they pour out upon one's hearing. Pianist Charles Rosen reminds us about Chopin's unhappy life as a Pole in exile, his stormy relationship with the writer Georges Sand, and his physical frailty. Franz Liszt claimed that Chopin himself had privately described the basis of his own character with the almost untranslatable Polish word Z-A-L. Liszt tried to paraphrase the richness of that word's meaning as, quote, inconsiderable regret after irrevocable loss, a ferment of resentment, sterile bitterness. And Liszt apparently found all of those emotions naturally in Chopin's music. Not always, but sometimes we find certain of the feelings often associated with many of the works of Chopin at this very time of year. Melancholy, longing, regret, even nostalgia. As we look back over the past year and into an unknown future. It's not all high spirits and razzmatazz as we remember and anticipate. Good morning, I'm Erica Funke. Today, on the final edition of Art Scene for the year 2000, we'll have our fair share of high spirits and razzmatazz. We'll meet a composer whose own life has been shaped by the music of Chopin. A piece that he and his partner wrote is titled Remembrance, and it was performed recently in Warsaw, where Chopin's family moved the same year that Frederick was born. We'll hear about nocturnes and night, first night especially, storytelling of all kinds, and more. So please stay with us. This is one of the ballades of Chopin, the third, that seems to gather momentum slowly, like a story that takes its time getting underway. Pianist Charles Rosen explains the movement of these ballades by Chopin is that of a story, but there are no events in the story, only elegiac expression. And Rosen says, if they were originally based on poems, the literal story is no longer important. As the ballades proceed, the tension and excitement is raised by way of variation and musical development, and Chopin places the climax as close to the end as possible, like the denouement of a written story or spoken tale. The life story of composer and keyboard artist Frank Locke Jr. has been greatly affected by the music and life of Frédéric Chopin. Last year, a year that marked the 150th anniversary of Chopin's death, Locke and his partner, Lena Reed, recorded their own orchestral piece, Remembrance, in Poland with the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra. And 2 days later, the work was performed in concert there by the Warsaw Philharmonic. The two walked the streets of Warsaw in between sessions, thinking of Chopin and his heritage. Frank Locke Jr. first met Chopin in the streets of his neighborhood in Wilkes-Barre, where he was born. His studies were in math and science, and eventually, as a member of NASA's Apollo team, Locke sat there at mission control when astronaut Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. But to hear him tell it, Locke's first encounter with Chopin was just as earth-shaking for him as that visit to the moon. Locke has been composing music for electronic keyboard for the past 22 years, and he is an award-winning electronic keyboard artist. In 1980, he met Lena Reed, who became his longtime partner in performing and teaching, and most recently in composing. Frank Locke and Lena Reed came in from Virginia to tell us more about their story and the story of remembrance.
In 1949, and I was 6 years old, and my parents started me on classical piano lessons with the neighborhood. And 1949 happens to be, coincidentally, it had been at that time the 100th anniversary of Frederick Chopin's death. And, of course, there's a large Polish population in Wilkes-Barre area. And so all the radio stations were playing this wonderful music. And I remember being 6 thinking, what is that music? This is incredible stuff, you know? And I would go outside and I would hear this music. And it was like, where's it coming from? Well, it turned out it was coming from not just one, but multiple sources. People would have their radios in their open windows because this would be the summertime, which before air conditioning. And so they'd be sitting on the ledge, or in one case, I think it was sitting on the front porch. And I'm going up and down the street thinking, they're all at the same station on. Now they're all playing the military Polonaise. What is this? And that was a very, very magical time, because it was an awakening to me that there really was not just good music, but there was a very specific composer and a very specific composer's music at a special time of commemoration that just changed my life, made all the difference. And so when I started piano lessons, almost the same, a couple months later, my teacher, who was Mrs. Ann Nichols, or Mrs. Boyack, she introduced me to a very simple version of the Chopin Minute Waltz. And there it was again. There was that wonderful chromatic pulling down that I said, well, that's what makes this music different. It has the chromaticism, not just thirds and sixths and fifths, but it's going up and down half step at a time. And so that was it. I was absolutely enchanted with that and the emotional effect that has on one. And that was the beginning. That was the music. And the next thing I remember hearing was in the late 50s when the popular music of the era rock and roll came along, and the Beatles. So all those things together tended to be significant in forming what eventually became my voice as a composer.
When we think about and we hear about all those teams like Lerner and Lowe and Rodgers and Hammerstein, and that's lyrics and music, but this is co-composition.
To a certain extent it is, yeah, and remembrance is the best example of that. Typically I would write the notes, write the pieces, and then we would get together at the keyboard and orchestrate them and arrange them. But on remembrance, it was Lena's idea that said, I got this idea for the story, and I'll let her tell how this happened, because it was actually a crazy thing a few years ago. And I tend to work on 2 or 3 pieces at a time. And I was working on a couple of little pieces called etudes, or micro etudes. And one day you came back and said, I forget.
I was teaching in a back area of the studio, and I remember hearing this piece, not complete, but I remember looking up and thinking, that's got to be part of a bigger piece. But he, as Frank said, would be working on 2 or 3 different etudes or preludes at a time. I walked back and I said, that piece you were playing, that little snippet, what was that? That needs to be a bigger, a grander piece that we can perform. And unfortunately, we lost it. we couldn't find it, and it took us about 4 weeks.
Yeah.
Frank kept going through. Well, was it this? And he would play a little part of an etude. No, that wasn't it, and it took 4 weeks to find that. Oh, I don't even know how long. Probably 1.5
Just a
minute.
couple of measures or so, and so I started playing it because sometimes I'll begin a piece and I'll forget it, and I'll come back. It'll come back to me later, and that's what happened with this particular thing. And so I started playing it, and all of a sudden I hear this eek
It was
from
in the back room.
He comes running down the hall,
rundown.
and it said, well, but then I said, but that's a little micro etude. That's not a big piece. How can you make a big piece out of that? And she said, I have an idea.
I said, no way.
So I sat patiently while she described what this wonderful story is. This story of love found, love lost, and love regained, basically. And it lasts about 13 minutes. And as she narrated to me the story, I would sit at the keyboard and say, what do you think about this? Is it, no, that's not right. And so we co-composed it in that sense. And so it truly is a collaboration, and one of our favorite pieces. And we are currently now working on another piece of that nature that we just started a little when we were in London. We got the idea for it, and so that's how it worked.
Can you tell us the story?
Sure. In a general sense, it is a story about love and romance, and essentially, when you hear the piece, it starts out very melancholy. Essentially, in my mind, it's about a gentleman, and the image that I have in my head is basically, I think of Poland, I think of Warsaw. Very gray outside, very cold, and this gentleman is essentially walking through the streets all alone, and it's a very sad beginning, and you get the feeling that here's this person by himself, and he continues to walk, and then the piece begins, and it progresses, and it moves into essentially the beginning of his life, or I should say the life with his wife. And the piece then takes you to the young love section. As it moves along, it progresses. They're married. As they grow as a couple, the piece continues. It moves on. Suddenly, you get this sense of something's going to happen. There's tragedy over the horizon, and the piece develops in that sense, and you can tell that something's going to happen. And through 3/4 of the piece, in the story, his wife unfortunately dies. And it's a very tragic end. But what happens through the cycle of the piece at the very end, he's back walking alone in the streets. But it's no longer a sad feeling, because he realizes that the love is not lost. It is still there. He's remembering the times that he had with his wife, all of those wonderful memories. And so what began as a very sad moment for him really ends up to being very wonderful. And that is the story that I had in my head. I have to say, with the piece, and I think one of the things that makes it so touching is that everyone that listens to it essentially can personalize this. Gives their own story.
As a matter of fact, we did a collaboration with a very gifted photographer from New York named Mark Sedan, and I said, Mark, we need images to project while we play this thing live, and we performed it at GW University, George Washington University.
Yes.
And what Mark did, that totally surprised me. He found old photographs that he had taken or people had taken of him in his young life, and going off to war, and his first love, and he put this montage together, and it was, in its own way, it was his story, not the same one that Lenna, but it was a good example of how he personalized it, and it came across. I get a little weepy-eyed just thinking about it, but it was just an exquisitely beautiful moment for the audience, and we had a little, discussion after the concert with the audience, so they could ask questions and how he read into it. And one of the audience members, if I remember, said that everyone has that story in their life.
It was performed in Poland.
Yes, it was.
So here you have this image in your mind of, as it happens, someone walking through the streets of Poland and so forth. What did the Polish musicians have to say, the conductor, the Polish people who heard the piece?
that's a very interesting question, since the conductor was actually a gentleman, John Yaffe, from New York City, and John just absolutely made the piece his own. He just got all the nuances from that orchestra.
When you were in Warsaw, did you get to the cathedral and see his heart?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
I mean, we did the Chopin walk, didn't we?
We did.
What did you see? What did you...
Well, remember that church? It wasn't far from the hotel, and it was where his heart is actually kept. And there, you just by being in that wonderful building, of course, all the buildings in Warsaw seem much older than they are. They were rebuilt after World War II, but they still have that aura. I mean, they rebuilt them so they look 200 years old, and we had that sense. I had that sense of history. Now, Chopin left Warsaw when he was just 20 years old, so he spent roughly half of his life there, and the other half in Paris. But I had a real sense of his presence there.
And I think back to Chopin and his heart going back to his homeland.
In a sense, absolutely, that's true. I don't know if he ever knew when he left Warsaw that would be the last time he would be on Polish soil alive. I think he thought he would live much longer than 39 years. But you're right. And he did, I think, in some way, what we try to do with our music is create his own world. Because what does an artist do? You know, an artist is usually someone who is hypersensitive to their surroundings, and hypersensitive to the point that when you see the world as it really is, perhaps not just the beauty, but you see the other side of it, and it's very difficult to deal with that. And so art is a way of expressing your world, your ideal world, both the strengths and also the sweetness of it, in a format that you can experience in a constructive way. And that's kind of what we do with our music. We transform and translate, because we're both professionals. We both work. We both have day jobs, fortunately, and we both have families. And so we translate that everydayness, which seems rather ordinary in many cases, into something that perhaps extraordinarily might affect other people.
Frank Locke Jr. and Lena Reed speaking about this piece, Remembrance, and their partnership. Remembrance was performed and recorded in Warsaw in September of 1999 with the Warsaw Philharmonic Orchestra in the year that marked the 150th anniversary of the death of Chopin. Locke and Reed are partners, and each one is an award-winning keyboard artist. They have performed at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. as part of the Wild Fusion concert that was a collaboration of music, art, and technology. Their music is distributed and well-rated by MP3, available as well on compact disc and their own website, www.lockereedmusic.com, LOCHREIDMUSIC, no spaces.com. Frank Locke was born in Wilkes-Barre, and he is currently Vice President of Stanford Telecom's Advanced Communications Systems Division at the George Washington University Center, adjacent to the Virginia campus. And Lena Reed is Deputy Director of the National Clearinghouse on Child Abuse and Neglect Information. Their new composition, Breakthrough, was just recorded with the London Symphony Orchestra in the famous Abbey Road Studios in London. We have a test pressing of the CD. It also contains Remembrance and other works by Frank Locke, including one of his micro etudes, which Locke says has been influenced by the etudes of Chopin.